Well, first, let me say I'm very happy to be here with you all. It's always very gratifying to share a love of beauty with other people, whether it's in music or painting or poetry. But I think poetry is, in this regard, has been very neglected. And so I'm very happy to be sharing this with you. And I'd like to thank David and Matt and Aaron for making this possible. I'm going to make some prepared remarks, and then I'd be happy to entertain questions and more discussion. In celebrating the anniversary of Keats's aptly named Miracle Year of 1819, in which he reached the height of his poetic powers in the composition of his great odes, I believe it is vital that we consider the context, both personally and historically, in which Keats produced them, and therefore better understand the intent and the overarching idea which emerges in the process of their unfolding. Keats was, as was Shelley, intensely aware of the attempt to suppress true creativity in art and also science in the wake of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, where Europe's established oligarchical forces sought to prevent the emergence of the spirit of the American Revolution, an expression of man's true identity as a creative being, each endowed with inherent rights and dignity. In England, the intellectual mafia, which controlled the literary journals, newspapers, and publishing industry, dealt with rebels like Shelley and Keats with either slander, as in the case of Shelley, or ostracization, as in the case of Keats. So when Keats was writing in 1819, he was dealing with an atmosphere of extreme hostility from all of those except a small circle of friends from whom he might reach a broader audience, as well as very countervailing influences in his personal life. For with the death of his mother, and not too long after also his brother, from tuberculosis, coupled with his budding love for Fanny Braun, yet painful awareness that the happiness it promised might never come to fruition, colored all of his thoughts and profoundly influenced his compositions during this period. I liken it to Beethoven's painful realization of his deafness, contemplation of suicide, yet triumphant declaration of his commitment to live, to create works of beauty out of love of mankind in his famous Heiligenstadt Testament. For Keats, through these odes, examines and works through his relationship to love, fame, beauty, and human history, and to creativity itself, in which, if we follow his journey with an open heart, indeed allows us to rise above the seeming tragedy of our mortal existence and to glimpse, if but briefly, that immortal and sublime world which I believe he inhabits. We see this self-examination with almost brutal honesty in Keats's untitled sonnet known as When I Have Fears, which I will recite here. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books and charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain. And when I see upon the night-starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I may never live to see thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. We must ask then, if love and fame, the love and fame he seeks, and not entirely for selfish reasons, sink to nothingness, what then remains? I believe this question is answered over the course of his great odes, as he develops the relationship of his own creative process and the passion associated with it to that which is eternal. This tension between the apparent weakness and fragility of our mortal existence and that which is infinite, or even very great in physical or moral terms, which makes us aware of the greatness within our own souls, in other words, our true spiritual nature, is what Schiller called the sublime. Although the limits of this brief presentation do not allow for a full treatment, poem by poem, of how Keats unfolds the ideas which come to a crescendo with the ode on a Grecian urn, what can be said, I believe, is that he knew where he was going from the beginning and set out methodically to get there. For a fuller treatment of this subject, I would refer you to my article, Keats's Great Odes and the Sublime, available on the Chained Muse website. I hypothesize therein that whatever the chronological order they were written in, there is a clear conceptual ordering to them, and that they all emerge from a single thought object, like an oak from an acorn. The Ode to Psyche announces his intention to become the priest for Psyche and to build her a temple in his mind. He bemoans the fact that she, who was not worshipped with the older Olympian gods, but was invented much later, and therefore has no sacred rites or tributes to her. Now, Psyche represents the human soul, and the story of her sacred marriage to Cupid is meant to symbolize the union of the mind, in this highest sense, with love, with passion. Once Keats discovers, through the composition of this poem, his mission and what it implies, he has an epiphany which unleashes a flood of poetic creation which one really has to experience for oneself. So I will not try to analyze it here. Over the next two odes, Ode on Sense by no means does them justice. Suffice it to say that Keats in these two poems penetrates more deeply into the most agonizing and painful paradoxes of human existence in a more open and honest way than perhaps any other has, thus enabling him and the reader to rise to the state of mind in which we are then ready to experience the profound truths contained in the Ode to a Nightingale and the Ode on a Grecian Urn. He manages, particularly in the Ode on Melancholy, to penetrate the soul in a way which I think is unparalleled in spoken language, having a similar cathartic effect to Beethoven's late quartets, for instance. The exhortation to not run from, but embrace the beauty that we know must fade, and all that in life we hold most dear that must die, is heartrending, yet somehow strangely liberating. Keats will return to this paradox again in the Ode to a Nightingale, but now with a level of understanding which allows the mind to overcome mortality, if only for a moment. I will recite it now. Ode to a Nightingale. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and Lethe words had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beechen green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance, Provençal song, and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beakerful of the warm south, full of the true the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou amongst the leaves hast never known. The weariness, the fever, and the fret, here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy, though the dull brain perplexes and retards, already with thee. Tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn, and eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mute rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that oft times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my sole self. Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades over past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? The tension Keats creates in the first three stanzas, between this mortal life, in which everything passes, even beauty, and the seeming immortal, ever fresh and vital, utterly free, yet unseen world, which the nightingale inhabits, is portrayed in the most profoundly moving way. He then evokes the creative spirit itself to suddenly leap out of this conundrum and achieve a union with the spirit of the nightingale. What he does next is truly amazing. He describes the natural surroundings which are unseen, as if in a clairvoyant trance, suffusing them with a spiritual light that is with the breezes blown. He has escaped the prison of sense certainty, the condition we all inherit by virtue of the fact that we have bodies, and now can see the world in its essential nature, as if from a higher spiritual state. He, however, makes clear that death alone is not the means to this higher state. Even if, while listening to the nightingale's song, still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, he says. It is something still higher, beyond us, yet able to inspire and move us. In fact, this is the spirit that has moved all the great thoughts of all human beings throughout history. With this realization, Keats brings us back to our everyday reality with the word forlorn, which is indeed the feeling we have upon realizing that we can, after all, only glimpse that higher world but for a moment. But the knowledge that it is there and that it resonates with something in each of our souls continues to move us in memory, like the nightingale's plaintive anthem echoing in the next valley glades. Keats takes this to an even higher conceptual level in the Ode on a Grecian Urn. But the limits of our discussion here, we can draw the inspiration to create new and beautiful poetic works which can contribute to a new renaissance in classical culture. Thank you. Well, I would just say that I don't think the aim of classical poetry is to escape the senses so much as to point out the paradoxes inherent in the senses and our relationship to the world because we are creatures of the senses. But it is precisely when I think that those paradoxes make us aware that there's something higher in us than our mere physical selves, that we feel uplifted and inspired because we realize we are not, that there's something immortal in us. And those paradoxes and those inherent paradoxes involved are the pathway to that realization of something higher. I think that's what Keats is doing in the Ode to a Nightingale. You know, in Schiller's great work on the Sublime, which is not long, it's only about 20 pages long. I highly recommend anyone who's interested in these. Sometimes when it's something very large like a mountain or the sea or the night sky, which suddenly makes us intensely aware of how small and seemingly weak we are as physical creatures. But yet something in the experience of it resonates with something in our souls, which all human beings throughout history have felt. That potential greatness within us, which is done in an even higher way in drama, and in poetry, but even the mere experience of it in nature will invoke this feeling of the sublime. And I think this is what great art aims at that which is universally human in all human beings. You find this reflected in every great culture on earth. Dave is studying this in Chinese poetry, which I've read a bit, in the poetry of the Arabic Renaissance, in Greece, and in the great classical poetry of Western Europe.